The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Ashfield Manor as Catherine Williams stood in the grand hallway, her heart pounding with the weight of words she had carried for 15 long years. The elegant mansion, with its polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers, had always felt more like a beautiful prison than a home. Today, it would become the stage for a truth that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of the Williams family forever. Catherine had been married to Charles Williams for 23 years, and in all that time, she had watched her husband's relationship with his sister and deteriorate into cold politeness and unspoken resentment. And, once vibrant and full of laughter, had become a shadow of herself after their father's death 15 years ago. She rarely visited, and when she did, the conversations were stilted and formal, filled with the kind of careful pleasantries that masked deep pain. Charles stood by the fireplace in his study, his tall frame silhouetted against the dancing flames. At 55, he still carried himself with the authority that had made him successful in business. But Catherine could see the weariness in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. He had been drinking more lately, not enough to call it a problem, but enough for Catherine to notice the subtle changes in his behavior, and sat in the leather armchair across from him, her usually perfect composure cracking around the edges. At 52, she had never married, dedicating her life instead to her work as a social worker, helping children who reminded Catherine painfully of and herself at that age, lost, searching for something that seemed forever out of reach. Her dark hair, so similar to Charles's, was pulled back in a severe bun, and her clothes, while expensive, seemed chosen more for armor than fashion. The conversation had started innocently enough, and had come for their monthly dinner, a tradition Catherine had insisted upon in hopes of bridging the gap between the siblings. They had talked about work, the weather, mutual acquaintances, all the safe topics that allowed them to avoid the elephant that had been sitting in the room for a decade and a half. But tonight was different. Tonight, Catherine had made a decision that would change everything. She had discovered the truth by accident 3 months ago, while helping Charles's elderly Aunt Clara clear out her attic before moving to a care facility. Hidden in a dusty box behind Christmas decorations, Catherine had found a collection of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakably that of Charles and his father, William Williams, and they were addressed to a woman named Margaret Thompson. At first, Catherine had hesitated to read them. Privacy was sacred, even for the dead. But something about the dates on the letters, all from the year and was born, had made her curious. What she found inside those yellowed pages had turned her world upside down and explained so many things that had never quite made sense about the Williams family. The letters revealed that William Williams had been having an affair with Margaret Thompson, a young secretary at his law firm. The affair had resulted in a pregnancy, and Margaret had given birth to a daughter that William had never acknowledged publicly, but had supported financially for 18 years. The letters detailed his anguish over keeping this secret from his family, his guilt over abandoning Margaret and their child, and his growing regret as the years passed. But the most shocking revelation came in the final letter, dated just 2 months before William's death. In it, he confessed that he had been wrong about the timing, and wasn't his biological daughter with his wife Eleanor. The affair with Margaret had begun earlier than he had originally thought, and through a painful process of discovery, he had come to realize that and was actually Margaret's daughter, the child he had given up, who had somehow found her way into his legitimate family through what could only be described as a cosmic twist of fate. Catherine had read that letter a dozen times, trying to make sense of it. How could and be both William's daughter and not his daughter at the same time? How could she be Margaret's child when everyone knew and had been born to Eleanor Williams? The answer came in subsequent letters that revealed the full, heartbreaking truth. Margaret Thompson had become pregnant twice by William Williams. The first pregnancy had ended in tragedy when Margaret, overwhelmed by her situation and William's refusal to leave his wife, had given birth prematurely to a daughter who lived only a few hours. Devastated by guilt, William had arranged for a proper burial and memorial, something that haunted him for the rest of his life. The second pregnancy, 18 months later, had resulted in another daughter, but this time Margaret had been determined to keep the child. She had hidden the pregnancy from William until it was too late for him to interfere. When the baby was born, Margaret named her Anne, after William's mother, hoping perhaps to create some connection between the child and the father who refused to acknowledge her. But fate had intervened in the cruelest possible way. When Anne was 6 months old, Margaret had been struck by a drunk driver while crossing the street. She had lingered in the hospital for 2 weeks before dying, leaving behind a baby with no family except a father who had never wanted to claim her. William had been forced to make an impossible choice. He could put the child up for adoption, condemning her to grow up never knowing her true parentage, or he could find another solution. That solution came in the form of his wife, Eleanor, who had been struggling with infertility for years. When William confessed the existence of his daughter to Eleanor, explaining that Margaret was dead and the child needed a home, Eleanor had surprised him by agreeing to raise Anne as their own. But there was a condition, and could never know the truth about her parentage. She would grow up believing that Eleanor was her biological mother, and William would never speak of Margaret Thompson again. To ensure this secret remained buried, they had fabricated Anne's birth certificate and destroyed any evidence of her true origins. For 11 years, the arrangement had worked, and grew up as a Williams, loved by Eleanor and tolerated by William, who struggled daily with the guilt of seeing Margaret's face in his daughter's features. But when in turn 12, Eleanor had been diagnosed with cancer, and during her treatment, she had begun to resent the presence of this child who wasn't really hers, this living reminder of her husband's betrayal. The resentment had poisoned the household. Eleanor had become cold toward Anne, finding fault with everything she did. William, torn between protecting his wife and his daughter, had withdrawn emotionally from both of them, and had grown up feeling like an outsider in her own family, never understanding why her mother seemed to dislike her so much, never knowing that the man she called father carried a secret that was slowly destroying him from within. When Eleanor died when Anne was 17, she had left behind a letter for William, confessing her regret for taking out her pain on but begging him to never tell the girl the truth. She couldn't bear the thought of and knowing that the woman who had raised her had spent the last 5 years of her life resenting her existence. William had honored Eleanor's dying wish, taking the secret to his own grave 3 years later. But his guilt had consumed him in those final years, making him distant and critical of and pushing her away when what she needed most was his love and acceptance, and had interpreted his behavior as disappointment in her, never knowing that every time he looked at her, he saw the woman he had loved and abandoned, the woman whose death was partly his responsibility. Standing in that hallway, Catherine understood now why and had always seemed like she was searching for something, why she worked so tirelessly to help other people's children, why she had never been able to form lasting romantic relationships. She was trying to fill a void that she couldn't even name, missing a piece of herself that she had never known existed. Charles, meanwhile, had grown up as the golden child, the legitimate heir who had never had to question his place in the family. But he had also grown up watching his sisters struggle with their parents' inexplicable coldness toward her, and he had internalized a sense of guilt about his privileged position that he had never been able to articulate. His success in business, his need to be perfect in everything he did, his difficulty expressing emotion. It all stemmed from a subconscious understanding that something was wrong in his family, something he was powerless to fix. The two siblings had spent their entire adult lives dancing around this unnamed trauma, loving each other, but unable to connect deeply because of the secrets that lay between them like landmines. Charles tried to protect, and in the only way he knew how, by being successful enough to take care of her financially if she ever needed it, and tried to prove herself worthy of love by dedicating her life to helping others, never understanding why she felt so fundamentally flawed. Now Catherine held the power to either heal these wounds or tear the family apart completely. The letters were upstairs in her bedroom, locked in a box that felt like Pandora's container. She could destroy them, let the secret die with her as it had with William and Eleanor. She could protect and from a knowledge that her entire life had been built on a lie. Spare her the pain of learning that the parents who raised her had struggled to love her authentically. But she could also give in the truth she had been unconsciously seeking her whole life, the explanation for why she had always felt like an outsider, the validation that her feelings of not quite belonging were based on reality, not imagination. She could give Charles the understanding he needed to make sense of his family's dysfunction, the key to unlocking the emotional distance that had characterized his relationships with both his sister and his parents. The weight of this decision had been crushing Catherine for 3 months. She had tried to find clues about Margaret Thompson, hoping to learn more about Anne's biological mother. But the woman had been erased from history as thoroughly as William had intended. There were no living relatives, no friends who remembered her, no trace of the woman who had given in life and then lost her own so tragically. But there was one thing Catherine had found, hidden in the very last letter in the box. William had written about a lullaby that Margaret used to sing to baby and a melody that had haunted him for years afterward. He described it as a song about a butterfly that had lost its wings, but learned to dance anyway, a metaphor for resilience that had seemed to comfort both mother and child during their brief time together. Catherine had researched the song and found it was an old folk tune called The Dancing Butterfly, rarely heard anymore, but still preserving collections of traditional music. On impulse, she had learned to play it on the piano, drawn by the connection it represented to Anne's lost mother. Tonight, as she listened to Charles and struggled through another awkward conversation, Catherine had noticed and humming absently under her breath while she stirred her coffee. The melody was hauntingly familiar, and with a shock, Catherine realized it was the dancing butterfly, the same lullaby her biological mother had sung to her as a baby. Somehow, impossibly, and had retained this fragment of her earliest memory, carrying it with her for 52 years without understanding its significance. The realization had hit Catherine like a physical blow, and she had excused herself to the hallway to steady herself against the overwhelming emotion. Now she stood there, tears streaming down her face, knowing that she couldn't keep this secret any longer, and deserved to know where that melody came from, deserved to understand the invisible threads that connected her to a mother she had never known she had lost. Charles deserved to understand why their family had always felt broken, why love had been such a complicated and painful thing in the Williams household. But telling them would change everything. It would shatter Anne's understanding of her entire life, force her to reconsider every relationship she had ever had with her supposed family members. It would burden Charles with the knowledge that he had spent 35 years unable to help his sister because he didn't understand what was wrong. It would expose the lies and secrets that had shaped their family for over 5 decades. Catherine took a deep breath and walked back into the study, her mind made up. She couldn't keep protecting them from the truth. Sometimes love meant causing pain in service of healing, meant breaking things open so that light could get in. Charles, and she said quietly, her voice trembling with the magnitude of what she was about to do. There's something I need to tell you both. Something about your family, about your father, that you have a right to know. Both siblings looked up at her, surprised by the intensity in her voice. Charles set down his brandy snifter and stopped mid-hum, the melody of the dancing butterfly, hanging in the air between them like a ghost from the past. Catherine pulled out the chair across from them and sat down, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking. The letters were still upstairs, but she didn't need them anymore. She had memorized every painful detail, every heartbreaking revelation. What I'm going to tell you is going to change everything, she continued, meeting each of their gazes in turn. It's going to hurt, and it's going to be confusing, and you might hate me for telling you. But I can't watch you both struggle with ghosts you don't even know exist anymore. You deserve the truth, even if it's painful. And leaned forward, her social worker instincts picking up on the gravity of Catherine's tone. Charles straightened in his chair, his business training telling him to prepare for difficult news. "Catherine, you're scaring us," and said softly. "What's this about?" Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage for what would be the most difficult conversation of her life. When she opened them again, she looked directly at and, seeing Margaret Thompson's features in the curve of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. And she whispered, "I found letters in your Aunt Clara's attic. Letters from your father. And they explain everything. Why you've always felt different. Why your relationships with your parents were so complicated. Why you and Charles have struggled to connect despite loving each other so much." She paused, watching Ann's face pale, and Charles's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "And sweetheart," Catherine said, her voice breaking with compassion, "Eleanor Williams wasn't your biological mother." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Catherine watched as everything and thought she knew about herself began to crumble. But this was only the beginning. There was so much more to tell, so many layers of truth to uncover, so many wounds to heal and create. The rain continued to drum against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour. In that elegant study, surrounded by the trappings of the life she thought she understood, and Williams was about to discover that she was someone else entirely, someone who had been lost and found and lost again before she was old enough to remember. And Catherine, having spoken the first of many truths that needed telling, prepared herself to guide them both through the revelation that would either destroy their family or finally set them free. The silence that followed Catherine's revelation was deafening. Anne sat frozen in her chair, her coffee cup trembling in her hands as the words echoed in her mind. "Eleanor Williams wasn't your biological mother." The sentence seemed impossible, absurd, like something from a movie rather than her real life. She had Eleanor's eyes, didn't she? People had always said so. She had her temperament, her way of holding her shoulders when she was nervous. Charles stood up abruptly, knocking over his brandy in the process. The amber liquid spread across the mahogany side table, but he didn't seem to notice. His face had gone completely white, and he was staring at Catherine as if she had just told him the earth was flat. "That's impossible," he said, his voice hoarse. "Catherine, what are you talking about?" And looks exactly like Mother. They had the same mannerisms, the same way of tilting their head when they were thinking. This is crazy talk. But even as he spoke, Charles felt something shifting inside his chest, a recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. There had always been something different about, and hadn't there? Something that made their father uncomfortable, that made their mother retreat into cold politeness whenever and try to get close. He had attributed it to personality differences, to the natural tensions that existed in any family. But what if there had been something else entirely? And finally, set down her coffee cup, her movements careful and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Catherine, I need you to explain exactly what you mean. I need to understand what you found in those letters." Catherine reached across and took Anne's hand, feeling how cold her fingers were despite the warmth of the room. "Your biological mother was a woman named Margaret Thompson. She worked as a secretary at your father's law firm. They had an affair that lasted about 2 years, and you were the result of that relationship." The words hit, and like physical blows, each one chipping away at the foundation of everything she thought she knew about herself. Margaret Thompson. The name meant nothing to her, and yet apparently this stranger was the woman who had carried her for 9 months, who had given her life. "Where is she now?" and asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the grief in Catherine's expression. "She died when you were 6 months old. Quel accident. Your father had never acknowledged you publicly, but when Margaret died with no family to take you in, he was forced to make a choice. He told Eleanor the truth, and somehow he convinced her to raise you as her own." Charles sank back into his chair, the implications washing over him in waves. "So Anne isn't really my sister," he said slowly, trying to process this new reality. "She's my half-sister, and Mother knew the whole time that she wasn't Anne's biological parent." "Yes," Catherine confirmed, watching the pain flicker across both their faces. But there's more, and it's important that you understand the whole story before you make any judgments about your parents' choices. And laughed bitterly, a sound that held no humor. More? How can there be more? You just told me that my entire life has been a lie, that the woman I called mother wasn't actually my mother, that my father had an affair, and I was the unwanted result. What else could there possibly be? Catherine squeezed Anne's hand tighter. Your parents weren't monsters, Anne. They were flawed people trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. Your father loved Margaret Thompson. It wasn't just a meaningless affair. And Eleanor agreed to raise you because she had been struggling with infertility for years. You were the daughter she had always wanted, even if you came to her in a way she hadn't expected. But Anne was shaking her head, pulling her hand away from Catherine's grasp. No, that doesn't make sense. If she wanted a daughter so badly, if she agreed to raise me, then why was she so cold? Why did I always feel like I was disappointing her, like nothing I did was ever good enough? This was the hardest part, and Catherine knew that what she was about to reveal would hurt, and even more than what she had already shared. But there was no way to soften the blow, no way to make the truth less painful. Because Eleanor got sick when you were 12, Catherine said quietly. Cancer. And during her treatment, during the years when she was fighting for her life and in constant pain, she began to resent your presence. You were a living reminder of your father's betrayal, of the affair that had brought pain into her marriage. She couldn't help how she felt, even though she knew it wasn't fair to you. Anne's face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. Everything made sense now. The sudden change in her mother's behavior when she turned 12, the way Eleanor had seemed to withdraw from her just when and needed her most. The criticism, the impossible standards, the feeling that nothing and did would ever be enough to earn her mother's love. So she spent the last 5 years of her life hating me and whispered through her tears. For something that wasn't my fault, for something I had no control over. She didn't hate you, Catherine said firmly. She was in pain, physical and emotional pain, and she took it out on you when she should have taken it out on your father. But she loved you too. The letters make that clear. She was torn between her resentment and her genuine affection for the little girl she had raised from infancy. Charles had been silent through this exchange, but now he stood up again and began pacing the length of the room. This explains so much, he muttered, running his hands through his hair. The way Father withdrew from all of us after Mother got sick. The way he could barely look at and during those last years. I thought it was because he was struggling with Mother's illness, but he was carrying this secret the whole time. And after Eleanor died, Catherine continued, your father carried even more guilt. Eleanor had made him promise never to tell Anne the truth about her parentage. She couldn't bear the thought of and knowing that the woman who raised her had spent years resenting her existence. So your father honored that promise, but it ate him alive. And looked up sharply. Is that why he was so distant with me after Mother died? I thought it was because I reminded him too much of her, because seeing me made his grief worse. But really it was because I reminded him of this other woman, this Margaret Thompson. Yes, Catherine said sadly. Every time he looked at you, he saw Margaret's face. He saw the woman he had loved and then abandoned, whose death he felt responsible for. The guilt was overwhelming, but he couldn't tell you the truth without breaking his promise to Eleanor. So he pulled away instead, which only made you feel more rejected and confused. The room fell silent again as in Anne. Charles absorbed this information. The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the wind was picking up, rattling the windows in their frames. The elegant study, with its leather-bound books and expensive furniture, suddenly felt oppressive, like a beautiful tomb filled with buried secrets. Finally, and spoke again, her voice stronger than before, but edged with anger. So let me make sure I understand this correctly. My biological mother died when I was a baby. My adoptive mother agreed to raise me, but ended up resenting me for circumstances beyond my control. My father loved my biological mother, but abandoned her, then spent the rest of his life feeling guilty about it while taking that guilt out on me. And my brother grew up watching all of this dysfunction without understanding what was really happening. Charles stopped pacing and looked at his sister, his half-sister, with new eyes. And I'm so sorry. I knew something was wrong in our family, but I never imagined it was anything like this. I should have done more to protect you from their emotional distance. How could you? And replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. You were just a kid too, and you didn't know any more than I did about what was really going on. But Charles shook his head. I was the older one. I was the legitimate son, the one who never had to question my place in the family. I should have noticed how differently they treated you. I should have said something when Mother started being so critical of everything you did. Catherine watched the two siblings grappling with their new reality and felt her heart breaking for both of them. This was exactly what she had been afraid of, the guilt and recrimination that could tear them apart even as the truth brought them closer together. You can't blame yourselves for not understanding something that was deliberately hidden from you, she said firmly. Your parents made choices, both good and bad, but they were their choices to make. You were children caught up in adult problems that were far too complex for you to understand or solve, and stood up suddenly and walked to the window, staring out at the stormy night. Tell me about her, she said without turning around. Tell me about Margaret Thompson. What was she like? Catherine had been dreading this question, knowing how little information the letters actually contained about Anne's biological mother. I'm afraid I don't know very much. Your father's letters were focused more on his feelings of guilt and regret than on describing Margaret as a person. But I can tell you a few things. She paused, choosing her words carefully. She was young when they met, probably in her early 20s. She was intelligent and hardworking. Your father mentioned her dedication to her job several times. And she was brave, because when she found herself pregnant with you, she decided to keep the baby despite knowing that your father wouldn't leave his wife to support her, and turned back to face the room, her expression hungry for any scrap of information about the woman who had given her life. Was she pretty? Did she have family? Where did she come from? The letters don't say much about her background, Catherine admitted. But your father did mention that she had a beautiful singing voice. He wrote about a lullaby she used to sing to you when you were a baby, something about a butterfly that learned to dance without wings. Anne's face went completely still. The dancing butterfly, she whispered. You know it? Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. I've been humming it my whole life, Anne said, her voice filled with wonder. I never knew where I learned it. I just thought it was something I made up. But it was her, wasn't it? My biological mother taught it to me. Yes, Catherine confirmed. According to your father's letters, it was Margaret's favorite song to sing to you. Somehow, you retained that memory even though you were so young when she died. For the first time since Catherine had begun her revelation, and smiled through her tears. I have something of hers, she said softly. A piece of her that I've been carrying with me all these years without even knowing it. Charles moved closer to his sister, drawn by the emotion in her voice. I've heard you humming that song hundreds of times over the years. At family dinners, while you're working, when you're stressed or tired. I never thought to ask where it came from. Because it was always just there, Anne replied. Like breathing or the color of my eyes. It was part of me in a way I couldn't explain. The three of them stood there in the firelight, connected by this new understanding of Anne's connection to her lost mother. But Catherine knew there were still more difficult conversations ahead, more questions that needed to be answered. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I think you both need to know about the impact this secret had on your family dynamics, about why your relationships with each other have been so complicated over the years. And Charles both looked at her expectantly, bracing themselves for whatever new revelation was coming. Charles, you grew up feeling guilty about your privileged position in the family without understanding why. You saw how differently your parents treated and you internalized a sense of responsibility for their behavior that was never yours to carry. That's why you've spent your adult life trying to be perfect, trying to be successful enough to somehow make up for the dysfunction you witnessed, but couldn't fix. Charles nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. I always felt like I had to earn my place somehow, even though I was the legitimate son. I never understood why I felt so guilty about my relationship with Father, why his approval meant so much to me. And Catherine continued, turning to face her fully. You grew up feeling like an outsider in your own family because you were sensing the truth on some level, even though you couldn't consciously understand what was happening. The feeling that you didn't quite belong wasn't in your imagination. It was based on real undercurrents of tension and secret keeping that surrounded your very existence, and wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. So everything I felt was real. The sense that I was different, that there was something wrong with me that I couldn't identify. It wasn't paranoia or insecurity. It was my subconscious mind picking up on the truth. Exactly, Catherine confirmed. And the distance between the two of you as adults, the difficulty you've had connecting emotionally despite clearly caring about each other, that's because you've both been carrying pieces of this puzzle without knowing how they fit together. Charles felt guilty about his advantages without understanding what he was feeling guilty about, and felt rejected and confused without understanding why she was being treated differently. Charles sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of decades of misunderstanding settling on his shoulders. We've wasted so much time, he said quietly. So many years of awkward conversations and missed opportunities to really know each other, all because we were dancing around a secret we didn't even know existed. And moved away from the window and sat down across from him, studying his face with new eyes. You're still my brother, she said firmly. Half-brother, technically, but you're still the person who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my math homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. Wait, Charles said, his brow furrowing with confusion. You never got married, and blushed slightly. I know. I meant theoretically. If I got married, I would have wanted you to walk me down the aisle. Despite everything, Charles smiled at this admission. Even now, even knowing that we're only half-siblings and that our father had an affair and lied to both of us our entire lives. Especially now, and replied without hesitation. Because now I understand why our family was so broken, why love was such a complicated thing in our house. And I understand that you were just as much a victim of this dysfunction as I was, just in a different way. Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched the two siblings begin to rebuild their relationship on this new foundation of truth. But she knew there were still more difficult conversations ahead, still more healing that needed to happen before they could fully move forward. There's one more thing, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to reveal. Something I discovered while researching Margaret Thompson, something that might help you understand your biological mother a little better. Both and Charles turned to her, their faces expectant and wary. I managed to track down the hospital record from when Margaret died, Catherine said carefully. There was a notation in her personal effects about a letter she had written, but never sent. The hospital kept it with her belongings, thinking that someday a family member might come looking for it. Anne's breath caught in her throat. A letter from my mother? A letter to you, Catherine confirmed. Written during the weeks after you were born, when she was struggling with your father's refusal to acknowledge you publicly. I have it upstairs, along with the other documents I found. But I want you to decide whether you want to read it or not. Some truths are more painful than the uncertainty they replace. And stood up immediately, her decision made. I want to read it. I need to read it. After 52 years of not knowing anything about the woman who gave birth to me, I need to hear her voice, even if it's painful. Charles rose as well, placing a protective hand on his sister's shoulder. Whatever it says, we'll face it together. As family, as brother and sister, regardless of what blood we do or don't share. Catherine nodded, wiping away her own tears. Then, let's go upstairs. Let's finish this conversation properly, with all the truth laid out between us. Your mother, both of your mothers, deserve to have their stories told completely, honestly, without any more secrets or shame. As they prepared to leave the study, and turned back one more time to look at the room where her understanding of herself and her family had been completely transformed. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out how to rebuild her sense of identity with this new information. She would have to decide how to honor both the woman who had given birth to her and the woman who had raised her, despite all their flaws and complicated feelings. But tonight, for the first time in her adult life, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged, standing beside the brother who had chosen to love her regardless of their shared genetics, supported by the sister-in-law who had chosen truth over comfort, finally, understanding the invisible forces that had shaped her entire existence. The storm outside was beginning to subside, and as they climbed the stairs together toward whatever revelations awaited them in Margaret Thompson's final letter, and felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of completeness, of finally being whole enough to face whatever truth was still to come. Catherine's bedroom felt like a sanctuary as the three of them gathered around the antique writing desk by the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear night sky filled with stars that seemed to shine with unusual brilliance. Catherine carefully unlocked the wooden box where she had kept Margaret Thompson's letter safe for the past 3 months, her hands trembling as she lifted out the yellowed envelope. The letter was addressed simply to my daughter, in handwriting that was both elegant and hurried, as if Margaret had been rushing to capture her thoughts before they escaped her. The envelope showed signs of age and careful handling, and there was a water stain in one corner that might have been from tears shed long ago. And sat in the chair closest to the desk, with Charles standing behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders for support. Catherine positioned herself across from them, ready to read aloud if the emotion became too overwhelming for her, and to continue. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Charles asked softly, studying his sister's face for any signs of doubt, and nodded, though her hands were shaking as she reached for the envelope. "I've been waiting my whole life to hear her voice, even though I didn't know it. I'm as ready as I'll ever be." She carefully opened the envelope, mindful of its fragile condition, and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thin and delicate, covered with the same elegant handwriting in faded blue ink. Margaret had written 4 pages front and back, filled with the thoughts and hopes of a young mother facing an uncertain future, and cleared her throat and began to read, her voice barely above a whisper at first, but growing stronger as she found her rhythm. "My dearest daughter, I am writing this letter on your 3-week birthday, sitting by the window in our little apartment while you sleep in the basket that serves as your crib. The afternoon sun is streaming across your face, and you look so peaceful, so perfect, that I can hardly believe you're real." And paused, overcome by the intimacy of these words written by a woman who had been dead for most of her life. The idea that someone had looked at her with such love and wonder when she was just weeks old felt both miraculous and heartbreaking. "I don't know if you'll ever read this letter," and continued, her voice catching slightly. "I don't even know if I'll have the courage to keep it rather than burning it in a moment of despair. But I need to tell you about the circumstances of your birth, about the choices I've made that have brought us to this difficult place, and about my hopes for your future, whatever that future might hold." Charles squeezed his shoulders gently, offering what comfort he could as she navigated these deeply personal revelations from the mother she had never known. "Your father is a good man who finds himself in an impossible situation. I want you to know that what happened between us was not meaningless or casual. We fell in love, truly and completely, but we fell in love at the wrong time and in the wrong circumstances. He is married to a woman who deserves his loyalty, and he has responsibilities that prevent him from acknowledging you publicly." And looked up at Charles and Catherine, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She didn't blame him, she said wonderingly. After everything he put her through, she still defended him. "Keep reading," Catherine encouraged gently. "There's more," and turned back to the letter, her voice growing steadier as she continued. "I could be angry about this situation, and sometimes I am, but mostly I'm grateful because loving your father gave me you, and You're the most precious gift I have ever received. When I hold you in my arms and watch you discover the world around you, I cannot regret any of the choices that brought you into existence." The words were like balm on wounds that, and hadn't even realized she carried. All her life, she had wondered if her birth had been wanted, if her existence had brought joy to anyone. To know that her biological mother had treasured her, even in such difficult circumstances, was healing in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. I've been thinking about what kind of life I can give you as an unmarried mother in 1973. The world is not kind to women in my position, and is even less kind to the children they raise alone. I have very little money, no family to speak of, and few prospects for improving our situation quickly enough to give you the stability you deserve. Anne's voice began to waver again as she read these practical concerns that revealed how desperately Margaret had wanted to do right by her daughter. "But I also know that you deserve to be loved completely, without reservation or shame. You deserve to grow up knowing that you were wanted, that you were planned for, and dreamed about even if you weren't planned for in the conventional way. You deserve a mother who can look at you without seeing the complications and heartbreak that brought you into this world." Charles found himself thinking about Eleanor Williams, the woman who had raised but had ultimately been unable to separate the child from the circumstances of her conception. How different Anne's life might have been if Margaret had lived, if she had been able to provide that uncomplicated love she wrote about so eloquently. "I sing to you every night before bed, a song about a butterfly who loses her wings but learns to dance anyway. I chose this song because I want you to know that even when life takes away the things we think we need to be happy, we can still find joy, still find ways to soar. I hope that somehow, even if we are separated, you will remember this song and know that it carries all of my love for you." And stopped reading, her hand flying to her throat as emotion overwhelmed her. She had hummed that song thousands of times over the years, never understanding why it brought her such comfort during difficult moments. Now she knew it was her mother's love, somehow preserved and passed down through the mysterious ways that memory works in infants. She knew, and whispered. Somehow she knew that we might be separated, and she was trying to give me something to hold on to. Catherine reached across and took Anne's free hand. "Your ability to remember that song, to carry it with you all these years, shows how strong the bond was between you, even in such a short time." After a few moments to compose herself, and continued reading. "I have made a decision that may seem strange to you when you're old enough to understand it. I have written a letter to your father, telling him that I release him from any obligation to me or to you. I'm not doing this because I don't love him or because I don't believe he loves us both. I am doing this because I want his feelings for you to come from choice, not from guilt or duty." Charles frowned, trying to understand the logic behind this decision. She was setting him free so that if he chose to be part of your life, it would be authentic? "I think so," Anne replied, though she was still processing the implications herself. She wanted him to love me because he wanted to, not because he felt trapped into it. If your father chooses to acknowledge you and be part of your life, then you will know that his love is genuine. And if he chooses to walk away, then at least you will be spared the confusion and pain of growing up with a parent who resents your existence. I would rather you be raised by strangers who choose to love you than by a father who feels burdened by your presence." The wisdom and sacrifice implicit in these words left all three of them speechless for a moment. Margaret Thompson had been willing to give up any chance of support or acknowledgement from the man she loved because she believed it would be better for her daughter in the long run. She couldn't have known that father would find a middle path, Charles said quietly. That he would arrange for you to be raised by Eleanor, but never fully claim you as his own. She was trying to protect you from exactly the kind of emotional confusion you ended up experiencing anyway. And nodded, understanding now why Margaret's plan had ultimately failed to protect her from pain. William Williams had chosen neither complete acknowledgement nor complete abandonment, but rather a complicated middle ground that had left everyone damaged. I want you to know that every moment of your short life so far has been filled with wonder for me. The way you grip my finger when you're nursing, the little sounds you make when you dream, the perfect curve of your ears, and the impossible softness of your skin. These are treasures I will carry with me forever, regardless of what the future brings. Anne's voice was thick with tears as she read these intimate details of her infancy, these moments that only her biological mother had witnessed and treasured. You have your father's eyes, dark and intelligent, but your mouth is purely your own, with a little upturn at the corners that makes you look like you're always about to smile. I hope you will smile often in your life, my darling girl. I hope you will find reasons for joy even when circumstances seem dark. The physical descriptions felt like gifts to Anne, who had always wondered which of her features came from which parent. To know that her eyes connected her to her father, while her smile was uniquely her own, gave her a sense of identity that she had been missing her entire life. If something happens to me, if I'm not able to raise you myself, I want you to know that giving you up will be the hardest thing I have ever done. But I also want you to know that I will do it if I believe it will give you a better life than I can provide. My love for you is not possessive. It is the kind of love that wants what is best for you, even if what is best for you means living apart from me. Catherine wiped tears from her own eyes as she listened to these words. Margaret Thompson had understood, at 23 years old, what many people never learned about true parental love, that sometimes loving someone meant letting them go. I have hidden a few things for you in case we are separated and you someday come looking for answers about where you came from. There's a photograph of me holding you when you were 2 days old, tucked inside my copy of Jane Eyre on the bookshelf. There's a lock of your baby hair in a small wooden box in my dresser drawer. And there's a recording I made of myself singing The Dancing Butterfly, which I hope will find its way to you somehow, someday. And looked up sharply. Catherine, did you find any of these things? The photograph, the hair, the recording? Catherine shook her head sadly. I am sorry, sweetheart. When Margaret died, your father collected her belongings, but I think he destroyed most of them. He was so consumed with guilt and the need to keep your existence secret that he probably thought keeping her mementos would be too dangerous. The loss of these tangible connections to her mother hit and like a fresh grief, but she forced herself to continue reading. My greatest fear is not that I might die young, though that frightens me terribly. My greatest fear is that you will grow up thinking you were unwanted, thinking that your existence was a mistake or a burden. Nothing could be further from the truth, my precious daughter. You were conceived in love, you have been carried in love, and you are being born into love, even if that love cannot take the conventional form that society expects. Charles found himself thinking about the years and had spent feeling like an outsider in their family, wondering if she was somehow flawed or unworthy of love. How much pain could have been prevented if she had known these words from the beginning? I want you to be brave, my darling. I want you to take up space in the world, to speak your mind, to refuse to be made small by other people's limitations. You come from a line of strong women, even if you never get to know them. My own mother died when I was 16, and her mother before that died young as well. But each of them faced their challenges with courage and grace. That strength is in your blood, in your bones, in the very essence of who you are, and felt a surge of pride and connection to these unknown ancestors, these women whose strength had somehow been passed down to her through genetics and through Margaret's fierce love. If you are reading this as a grown woman, then you have survived whatever challenges life has thrown at you, and I am proud of you for that survival. I hope you have found work that fulfills you, people who love you for exactly who you are, and moments of beauty that make all the struggle worthwhile. The accuracy of this prediction was startling, and had indeed found fulfilling work as a social worker, helping children who reminded her of herself. She had found people who loved her, even if those relationships had been complicated by her sense of being fundamentally different. And she had found moments of beauty, though perhaps not as many as Margaret had hoped for her. I want to close this letter by telling you something that I hope you will remember always. You are enough, exactly as you are. You don't need to prove your worth or earn your place in the world. Your existence is justified by itself, by the love that created you, by the joy you have brought to every day of your young life so far. Anne's voice broke completely on these words, and Charles moved around to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. She's right, he said firmly. You are enough, Anne. You always have been. I'm sorry it took us so long to figure out how to show you that. And managed a trembling smile through her tears. How could you show me something you didn't understand yourselves? We were all doing the best we could with incomplete information. There's just a little more, Catherine said gently, looking at the final paragraph of the letter, and took a deep breath and continued reading. I'm going to mail this letter to myself and put it away somewhere safe with instructions that it should be given to you if anything ever happens to me. I don't know what the future holds for either of us, my precious girl, but I know that love like ours cannot be destroyed by death or distance or time. Somewhere in your heart, you will always carry the memory of these first weeks we spent together, learning each other, marveling at the miracle of your existence. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, I will always be watching over you, proud of the woman you become, and grateful for every moment I was privileged to be your mother. All my love, always and forever, Margaret Thompson. Written on October 15th, 1973, on the most beautiful Sunday afternoon of my life. The silence that followed was profound and sacred, and carefully refolded the letter and held it against her chest, as if trying to absorb every word into her heart. Margaret Thompson had been dead for over 50 years, but through these words, she had finally been able to speak to her daughter, to offer the love and validation that had been searching for her entire life. She was only 23, Charles said wonderfully. Younger than you are now when you graduated college. How did she have so much wisdom? Love makes us wise, Catherine replied. The kind of love Margaret felt for her, and the kind that puts the child's well-being above everything else, that creates clarity about what really matters. And looked up from the letter, her face transformed by a peace that none of them had seen there before. I understand now why I became a social worker, she said quietly. I've been trying to give other children what she gave me in that letter. The knowledge that they are wanted, that they are enough, that their existence matters. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. And I understand why relationships have been so difficult for me. I've been waiting my whole life to find someone who could love me the way she described in this letter, completely and without reservation. But I was looking for it in romantic relationships when what I really needed was to know that I had been loved that way as a child. Charles joined her at the window. Do you think you can forgive them now? Father and Eleanor, knowing what really happened, understanding the impossible position they were all in, and considered this question carefully. I think so. Not because what they did was right, but because I understand now that they were all just human beings trying to navigate an impossible situation. Margaret was trying to protect me by setting Father free. Father was trying to honor his promises to both the women he loved. Eleanor was trying to be generous despite her own pain. They all failed in different ways, but they were trying. She turned back to Catherine, who was carefully placing the letter back in its envelope. Thank you, she said simply, for finding this, for keeping it safe, for having the courage to share it with us. I know this couldn't have been easy for you. Catherine smiled through her own tears. You deserve to know the truth. Both of you. Your family has carried these secrets for too long, and secrets like this have a way of poisoning everything they touch, even when people don't consciously know they exist. And looked at her brother, this man who had been part of her life for over 50 years, but whom she felt she was meeting for the first time. So what happens now? How do we move forward with all of this new information? Charles didn't hesitate. We build something new, he said firmly. We take the best parts of what our parents gave us and leave behind the dysfunction and the secrets. We choose to be family in a way that's honest and healthy and based on who we really are rather than who we thought we were supposed to be. And we honor her, and added, gesturing toward the letter. "We honor Margaret Thompson by living the kind of life she hoped I would have. Brave, honest, full of love and service to others. We don't let her sacrifice be wasted." Catherine watched the two siblings make these promises to each other and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had agonized for months about whether telling them the truth was the right thing to do, whether the pain of revelation would be worse than the pain of ignorance. But seeing them now, finally able to understand themselves and each other clearly, she knew she had made the right choice. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the horizon. They had spent the entire night unraveling decades of family mystery, and now they would spend the coming days and months learning how to be family in this new way, with truth as their foundation instead of secrets. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to stand together in the soft light of early morning, finally whole, finally free from the ghost that had haunted them for so long, and had found her mother's voice at last, and in finding it, she had found herself. The dancing butterfly had finally remembered how to fly. 6 months had passed since that transformative night at Ashfield Manor, and the Williams family was still adjusting to their new reality. The revelation of Anne's true parentage had rippled through every aspect of their relationships, forcing them to re-examine not just their understanding of the past, but their hopes for the future. Anne had taken a leave of absence from her job as a social worker, using the time to process everything she had learned and to begin the difficult work of rebuilding her sense of identity. She had moved temporarily into the cottage on Charles and Catherine's estate, finding comfort in being close to family while she navigated this emotional journey. The cottage had become a sanctuary for healing conversations and rediscovered connections, and had converted the small sitting room into a workspace where she was writing a memoir about her experience, hoping that telling her story might help other adopted children who struggled with questions about their origins. The walls were now covered with genealogy charts as she attempted to piece together what little she could discover about Margaret Thompson's family history. Charles had undergone his own transformation during these months. The guilt he had carried unknowingly for decades had lifted once he understood its source, but it had been replaced by a fierce determination to make up for lost time with his sister. He had scaled back his business commitments significantly, delegating more responsibility to his partners so that he could be present for Anne's healing process. Catherine watched both siblings navigate their new reality with a mixture of relief and concern. The truth had set them free in many ways, but it had also opened up wounds that would take time to heal properly. She had become the family historian, carefully organizing all the documents and letters they had discovered, creating a comprehensive record of the Williams family story for future generations. On a crisp spring morning, Anne sat at the small desk in her cottage, staring at a blank page in her notebook. She had been trying to write about her feelings toward Eleanor Williams, the woman who had raised her, but whose love had been so complicated and conditional. It was the hardest chapter to tackle because it required her to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously: gratitude for the care she had received and anger at the emotional damage that had been inflicted. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Charles approaching with a steaming cup of coffee and what looked like a manila envelope tucked under his arm. "I brought breakfast," he announced as she opened the door, gesturing to the coffee and the bag of pastries he carried. "And something else that I think you'll want to see." And accepted the coffee gratefully, breathing in its rich aroma before taking her first sip. "What's in the envelope?" "Catherine found something else in Clara's attic yesterday," Charles said, settling into the armchair across from Anne's desk. "She wanted to wait until we could look at it together, but I convinced her that you should see it first," and set down her coffee cup, her hands already trembling slightly. Every new discovery felt like opening a door to a room she didn't know existed, and she was never sure whether she would find treasure or pain waiting inside. "More letters?" she asked. "No," Charles replied, handing her the envelope. "Something else entirely." Inside the envelope, and found a small wooden jewelry box, worn smooth with age and decorated with intricate carvings of butterflies and flowers. Her breath caught as she recognized the significance. This had to be the box Margaret had mentioned in her letter, the one that contained a lock of baby hair. With shaking hands, Anne opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was indeed a tiny curl of dark hair tied with a silk ribbon. But there was also something else, something Margaret hadn't mentioned in her letter, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. And lifted the locket carefully, noting its weight and the intricate engraving on its surface. The front was decorated with the same butterfly motif that appeared on the box, and when she found the tiny clasp and opened it, she gasped. Inside was a miniature photograph of Margaret Thompson holding a baby, clearly in herself at just a few days old. The image was tiny and somewhat faded, but it could make out her mother's face clearly for the first time. Margaret had been beautiful, with large, expressive eyes and a gentle smile that radiated love and wonder as she looked down at her newborn daughter. "Oh my God!" and whispered, bringing the locket closer to examine the photograph. "Charles, look at this. It's her. It's my mother." Charles leaned forward to study the tiny image, noting the resemblance between Margaret and that was now so obvious. "You have her nose," he observed softly, "and her expression when you're concentrating on something. I can't believe I never noticed before," and carefully removed the lock of hair from the box, marveling at its softness despite the passage of 52 years. "She kept this," she murmured, "a piece of me from when I was too young to remember anything. And somehow it survived all this time." "There's more," Charles said gently. "Catherine found something else with the box. A letter addressed to you, but not from Margaret," and looked up in surprise as Charles handed her a second, smaller envelope. This one was newer, the handwriting unfamiliar, but somehow similar to her father's formal script. "It's from Aunt Clara," Charles explained, "written just before she moved to the care facility. Catherine found it tucked inside the jewelry box, and opened the envelope with care, unfolding a single sheet of lavender stationery covered with Clara's shaky handwriting. "My dear," and she read aloud, "if you are reading this, then someone has finally found the items I've kept hidden for your father all these years. William gave these things to me shortly after Margaret's death, asking me to destroy them, but I could never bring myself to do it. A mother's love should not be erased, even when circumstances make it inconvenient to remember," and paused, processing the implication that Clara had known the truth about her parentage for over 50 years. "I watched William struggle with his secret every day after Eleanor became ill," and continued reading. "I saw how it poisoned his relationship with you, how the guilt made him withdraw when what you needed most was his love and support. I tried many times to convince him to tell you the truth, but he was bound by his promise to Eleanor, and he was a man who honored his commitments, even when they caused great pain." Charles shook his head in amazement. So many people knew pieces of the truth, but nobody was willing to put it all together and tell you directly. "I want you to know that Margaret Thompson was a lovely young woman who adored you completely," and read on. "I met her twice, once when she came to the office looking for William after you were born, and once at the hospital before she died. Even in her grief and pain, she spoke only of her love for you and her hopes for your future. She made William promise to ensure that you would grow up knowing you were wanted, though I'm afraid that promise was harder to keep than any of us anticipated," and felt tears beginning to flow as she realized that Clara had carried this burden for so many years, watching and struggle with feelings of rejection while knowing the truth that could have helped her understand her family's dysfunction. "Margaret asked me to give you something if the opportunity ever arose," and continued, her voice thick with emotion. "She said that if you ever came looking for answers about your origins, you should know that she never stopped loving you, not even for a moment." The butterfly locket was her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who faced difficult circumstances with courage and grace. She wanted you to have it as a reminder that you come from strong women, that you have inherited their resilience along with their capacity for deep love, and clutched the locket tighter, understanding now that this small piece of jewelry represented a connection not just to her mother, but to a line of women she would never know, but whose strength lived on in her. I'm sorry that I was too much of a coward to tell you this truth myself when you were young enough for it to make a difference in how you understood your place in the family, and read through her tears. But I hope that knowing it now will help you forgive the people who loved you, but didn't know how to show it properly. Your father was not perfect, but he was not cruel. Eleanor was not your enemy, though her pain made her act like one sometimes. They were just human beings trying to navigate an impossible situation without a map. The letter concluded with Clara's signature and a postscript that made him smile through her tears. P.S. Margaret was right about your resilience. You became exactly the kind of woman she hoped you would be: strong, compassionate, devoted to helping others. She will be very proud, and sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the impact of these new revelations. The locket felt warm in her palm, and she found herself tracing the butterfly engraving with her finger, thinking about the generations of women who had worn it before her. "I want to wear it," she announced suddenly, fastening the delicate chain around her neck. The locket settled perfectly just above her heart, and she felt an immediate sense of connection to Margaret and to the grandmother and great-grandmother she would never know. Charles watched his sister transform as she claimed this piece of her heritage. "It suits you," he said simply. "It looks like it was always meant to be yours. There's something I need to tell you," and said, looking directly at her brother. "Something I've been thinking about ever since we learned the truth about my parentage." Charles waited patiently, noting the determined set of Anne's jaw that indicated she had come to an important decision. "I want to change my name," she announced. "Not completely, but I want to add Thompson as a middle name. And Thompson Williams. I want to honor my biological mother while still acknowledging the family that raised me." Charles considered this proposal carefully. "What about Eleanor? You'd still be honoring her by keeping the Williams name, but adding Thompson seems like it might complicate the legal paperwork." "I know it's complicated," Anne replied, "but I need to do this for myself. I spent 52 years not knowing where half of me came from, and now that I know about Margaret, I want to carry her name forward. I want there to be some official record that she existed, that she mattered, that she was my mother." Charles nodded slowly, understanding the deep psychological need behind his sister's decision. "Then, we'll help you make it happen. Whatever legal hurdles we need to jump through, whatever paperwork needs to be filed, we'll handle it together. There's something else," and continued, her voice growing stronger with each declaration of independence. "I want to establish a scholarship fund in Margaret Thompson's name for young single mothers who are trying to get an education while raising their children. I've been thinking about this for months, and I think it's something she would have wanted, helping other women in situations similar to hers." Catherine appeared at the cottage door just as Anne was finishing this announcement, carrying a picnic basket and wearing an expression of excitement. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I couldn't wait any longer to share what I found at the library yesterday." She set the basket down and pulled out a manila folder thick with photocopied documents. "I've been researching Margaret Thompson's family history, and I finally found something significant." And Charles gathered around as Catherine spread the papers across the small dining table. "Margaret had a sister," Catherine announced, "younger by about 8 years. Her name was Patricia Thompson, and she's still alive. She lives in Portland, Oregon, and she's been looking for information about Margaret for over 40 years. The room fell silent as this news sank in. And had an aunt, a living connection to Margaret's family, someone who might have memories and stories about the woman who had given her life. "She never knew about you," Catherine continued gently. "Margaret died before she could tell her family about the baby, and your father's desire for secrecy meant that Patricia never learned she had a niece. But when I contacted her yesterday and explained the situation, she started crying and said she had been praying for this moment for decades, and felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. After a lifetime of believing she had no connection to Margaret's world, she was discovering that there was family out there, people who had wondered about her existence, people who might be able to fill in the gaps in Margaret's story. "She wants to meet you," Catherine said softly. "She's willing to travel here, or we could arrange for you to visit her in Portland, whatever you're comfortable with. She says she has photographs of Margaret, stories about their childhood, things that Margaret created that she's been keeping all these years, hoping someday to find a family member to share them with." And looked at Charles, seeing her own mixture of excitement and nervousness reflected in his expression. "What do you think?" she asked. "Am I ready for this?" Charles took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I think you're ready for whatever comes next. You've already faced the hardest part, learning the truth about your origins and finding a way to integrate that knowledge into your understanding of yourself. Meeting Patricia will just be adding more pieces to a puzzle you're already solving." And nodded, feeling the weight of the butterfly locket against her chest and drawing strength from its symbolism. "Then let's do it. Let's arrange for her to visit. I want to hear everything she can tell me about Margaret, about our family, about where I really come from." Catherine smiled broadly, clearly delighted by this decision. "I'll call her this afternoon and start making arrangements." She mentioned that she has something special she's been saving for Margaret's child, something that she thinks will mean a great deal to you. As they spent the rest of the morning planning for Patricia's visit and discussing the scholarship fund and wanted to establish, and felt a profound sense of completion settling over her. For the first time in her life, she was actively choosing her identity rather than simply accepting the one that circumstances had imposed on her. She was claiming her heritage, honoring her truth, and building bridges between the different parts of her story. The butterfly had not only learned to dance, she was finally ready to soar. That evening, as the sun set over the grounds of Ashfield Manor and sat in the cottage garden with the butterfly locket gleaming in the golden light, she had started a new journal, one dedicated specifically to documenting her journey of discovery and healing. The first entry was a letter to Margaret Thompson, a message she would never be able to send but needed to write nonetheless. "Dear Mother," she wrote, "I finally heard your voice today, and it was even more beautiful than I imagined it would be. Thank you for loving me so completely in the brief time we had together. Thank you for the lullaby that has comforted me my entire life. Thank you for the strength you passed down to me, the strength I'm finally learning to recognize and claim. I understand now why you made the choices you did, and I forgive the people who couldn't love me the way you wanted them to. I'm going to spend the rest of my life honoring your memory by living the kind of life you hoped I would have, brave, honest, full of service to others. I love you, and I'm proud to be your daughter, always and forever." And Thompson Williams. As she closed the journal and prepared to go inside, and caught herself humming The Dancing Butterfly, and smiled. For the first time in her life, she understood exactly where the song had come from and exactly what it meant. She was the butterfly who had lost her wings, her mother, her original identity, her sense of belonging, but she had learned to dance anyway. And now, finally, she was ready to fly,